Greetings to all. So we are now going to start our last event in the long series. So, Excellencies, the delegates, on behalf of the co-organizers, it's my pleasure to warmly welcome you and thank you for having joined us at Palais des Nations and online for what is the event concluding the second edition of the Geneva Rights and Environment Talks, organized in the margins of the Human Rights Council. So this is indeed the sixth talk, impacting and reflecting on the key messages that the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment stressed in her first report to the Council on the ocean and human rights. And I think we can all confirm that the talks were complementary. It's impressive to look back at the numerous ocean human rights issues that we have been addressing. Actually, they were addressing the report, but we have been learning a lot through this journey, even in the talk that just concluded a few minutes ago. In this, and also in your side event that was not part of this series of events, but that also addressed other interesting topics. So in this last talk that I will have the pleasure to moderate, we will be discussing how marine pollution violates fundamental rights. And before I invite the UN Special Rapporteur, as it pointed to open the event, this is something I haven't been saying earlier today, but reminding everybody that the summaries of all these events will be available on the webpage of each of the events, the video as well. And for who is online, you can access a transcript in over 100 languages. You can look at the slide how this works. So now, to help us setting the scene on the discussion that we are discussing, and indeed pollution is an important topic for International Geneva, because we have here numerous actors who are addressing pollution issues, as we will hear later. So to help us setting the scene on what is on this topic at the nexus on oceans and pollution, let's turn to the UN Special Rapporteur and let her present the key messages of her report.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you very much, everyone. It has been definitely an intense week since last Tuesday and over the last few days. And yeah, it's amazing to finish this whole series of talks and side events and the presentation of the report with talking about will the ocean remain blue, which is kind of a difficult and painful question. But of course, as we know, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to do the report on the ocean, is that it's one single biome. And as many people have also said, that maybe the Earth should be called the ocean instead of the Earth, because it's actually 70% of the ocean. But independently, of course, of the concept and the names, we know that the ocean is not only the place where life on Earth began millions of years ago, but also is a connector. It's a place where it's also ecosystems and the biomes are connected and are key for many things. And to keep, and I love now we're pollinizing each other's ideas, because Eve in the last side event mentioned that without the ocean we don't have life, and that's true. No ocean, no life. Maybe that should have been the phrase for the report, but we can take it from now. And there are many challenges that the ocean is facing, and without any doubt, pollution, both marine pollution and pollution from the land, including plastic pollution, is one of the biggest challenges that the ocean is facing. So that is one of the things that we definitely have to link, is to, instead of seeing each issues or areas that we're looking at in an isolated way, knowing that it's very important to specialize and to advance key things and priority things specifically, but really reminding ourselves and having in mind that it's part of one single ocean. It's a biome that is interconnected. And as human rights are not isolated, because of course when we talk about human rights, we also talk about the universality of human rights, the interconnection of human rights, the indivisibility of human, we're not talking about invisibility, the indivisibility of human rights. So of course, it's not about the human right to a healthy environment and not respecting other rights. We have to find ways and to interconnect and make sure that all human rights are protected. And so that's one of the key things about both the report and the issues. And when we talk about challenges, we're not also talking about marine pollution or plastic in an isolated way. So things are connected, including weak governance and difficulty to advance the rule of law, but also industrial fisheries and all the pollution that different industries, but including industrial fisheries, fossil fuel industries, the disorder of coastal urbanization, and lack of planning, land pollution, of course, climate change, not only the impacts from climate change, but also activities, including fossil fuels that are increasing the climate change. And I included also deep sea mining and marine engineering and blue economy as challenges, because of course, all of this is interconnected. And while plastic pollution is one and other pollution is one issue, it's very important to highlight the interconnection of that. And I want to highlight and highlighting or mentioning I'm clearly tired, sorry, the obligation of states. And in there, it's very important to remind the connection of the ocean from a human rights perspective, but because it's not only about communities and indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities, coastal communities, but we know that states have obligations. The obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, which include the obligation to regulate, to control effectively, to monitor activities that are happening in the ocean and impacting human rights, but also undertake environmental impact assessment, to implement the precautionary principle, definitely linked to deep sea mining and other activities that can be increasing the impact on the ocean, and also the obligation to restore. That's key. It's not only about what happens here, but we have to take into consideration the damage that already has happened in the ocean and restore ecosystems. And that, of course, is linked to a lot of pollution, including from plastic pollution, and the obligation to cooperate. I didn't have time, and I will definitely follow up, but in the interactive dialogue on Friday, a lot of the states, I had the honor to have 86 states to talk about and to take the floor. And a lot of the states were asking me, what do we have to do and how can we better protect the ocean? Cooperating and, of course, fulfilling their obligations is key. And I want to also finish with the obligation of businesses, the responsibility for businesses and of businesses to protect human rights, including the right to a healthy environment. And I would like to stop there because I would love to also hear from other interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Special Rapporteur. Let's indeed start the panel discussion. And our first speaker today, with our first speaker, we are going to look how multilateralism is addressing pollution and looking at synergies among processes, which is something you also reflect in your report. We have with us Bernardo Roca Rey, who is a Minister Consular at the Permanent Mission of Peru here in Geneva, and who has been very active in various fora, as you will soon hear. At the second session of the Human Rights Council, Peru delivered a statement underscoring on behalf of 33 countries that the impact of plastic pollution on a broad range of human rights is undeniable. You have also been, Peru, at the forefront of other statements and resolutions on pollution in other multilateral processes, calling for coordinated action among processes. So, Bernardo, can you share with us a few thoughts on the experience of Peru in bringing forward the topic of pollution, including in the ocean?
Well, thank you very much, Diana, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, first of all, to the organizer of this meeting, to the Geneva Environmental Network, to the Special Rapporteur for convening this important meeting on such a crucial issue such as healthy oceans. A healthy ocean is vital for robust biodiversity and thriving ecosystems, core elements of the right to a healthy environment. It also supports other fundamental aspects of that right, including a safe climate, sustainable food and water, a non-toxic environment, and clean air. Yet, marine pollution from unsustainable human activities, such as plastic and microplastic contamination, chemical waste dumping, and destructive fishing practices, remains one of the most devastating challenges facing the ocean. Peru has a long-standing commitment to ending pollution in the ocean, including in multilateral fora. As an example, Rwanda and Peru presented a historic UNEA Resolution 5/14 that launched the process for a legally binding instrument to address UN plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, under the framework of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, known as INC. Peru also submitted in the framework of the World Health Assembly in 2023 a resolution on the impacts of chemical waste and pollution in human health. In this sense, Peru's commitment to prioritizing multilateral efforts to reduce and eliminate pollution is not new. In the coming months, we will have two important meetings: the upcoming third United Nations Ocean Conference and the INC 5.2, aimed at reaching an agreement on the Plastic Pollution Treaty. The Ocean Conference will provide a valuable opportunity to give a significant political boost to the INC process, one of the most ambitious and important environmental initiatives in recent years. Every day, the equivalent of 2,000 garbage trucks full of plastics are dumped into the world oceans, rivers, and lakes. Every year, 19 to 23 million tons of plastic waste leaks into aquatic ecosystem, polluting lakes, rivers, and seas. For this reason, I would like to focus my intervention on the future plastic treaty and how it can address the human rights implication of pollution, particularly in the ocean. It is important to understand that in working to effectively eliminate plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, and mitigate the diverse effects of plastic pollution and production on the environment and human health, states will invariably and intrinsically have to take measures that promote and protect human rights, such as the human right to a clean and sustainable environment and the highest attainable standard of health. In this sense, incorporating a human rights perspective into the treaty on plastic doesn't just mean including it in the list of principles or incorporating an article in the text itself. To effectively design a plastic treaty that is sensitive to a wide range of relevant human rights, we must rethink the entire life cycle of plastic through a human rights lens. First and foremost, plastic pollution is a transboundary problem that no single country can solve, as ocean's currents carry thousands of kilometers from its source. Addressing its adverse effects requires multilateral action and global cooperation, recognizing that pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change are interconnected challenges. These issues not only harm the environment, but also threaten human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, safe drinking water and sanitation, adequate housing, and the highest sustainable standard of health, as I mentioned before. Secondly, pollution across the full life cycle of plastic disproportionately impacts those living in vulnerable settings, aggravating existing inequalities. The impacts on the indigenous people who have preserved and sustainably used ecosystems for millennia are particularly apparent and drastic. Pollution, particularly plastic pollution, poses a disproportionate threat to countries that rely on their oceans for ecotourism to sustain their economies. Peru, as many other coastal countries, is a prime example of this vulnerability. Pollution, specifically plastic pollution, must be considered from a human rights lens, particularly when analyzing its impact on women's and girls' rights. Numerous studies have been carried out by the UN Environment Programme that have concluded that women and girls are particularly exposed to toxic smoke created by unsafe practices, such as burning plastic waste, and are overrepresented in vulnerable and frontline communities, such as waste pickers or urban poor. Last but not least, the impact on biodiversity is not yet fully comprehended. We have all seen the pictures or read the news about how plastic pollution is affecting the biodiversity. Turtles entangling in plastics, or dead whales and dolphins stranded on the beach with their stomach full of plastic. The impact of plastic pollution seems clear with these images, but we are unaware of the full extent of the impacts of plastic pollution in our ocean, the environment as a whole, or in our own health. As an example of new research, I can mention that recent studies in Australia have shown that in population of marine birds that consume plastic leads to a widespread scar tissue, and scientists coined it a new term to describe this disease state, plasticosis. More evidence is appearing everywhere in the world as we speak, because plastic pollution knows no boundaries. we still don't fully know how this affects human health and sustainable economic models. The decision to commence negotiations leading to a global legally binding instrument on plastic pollution is a recognition of the need to address the international governance gaps that exist across the full life cycle of plastics and associated chemicals to prevent impacts on human health and the environment, which is in essence impacts on human rights. To this end, we need to understand how and to what extent plastics and their associated chemicals adversely affect human rights and oceans, and rethink how the new plastic pollution instrument can address plastics starting from a molecular level, then as a material and a product, and finally as a waste. With tangible and updated research on the linkages between human rights, pollution, and ocean health, states can counter efforts to weaken the human rights approach to the treaty with outdated and reliable data during negotiations. This is why Peru was part of the core group that drafted the decision to task the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee last year with studying the human rights implication of the life cycle of plastic, which conclusions we heard a few weeks ago. With these brief reflections, I would like to thank again the organizer for inviting me and looking forward for the fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rocaray. I think this focus on plastic was very important, and we have indeed an important milestone this summer waiting for us. You were there at the beginning when the resolution was put forward, so we hope also that what is coming back to Geneva in August will also bring good news for the communities who are most impacted. And indeed, our next speaker is, we are now looking at how communities are impacted. And our next speaker is Doris Ramirez, who was already with us at the previous talk on defenders. She joins us from the Function for Collective in Champerico, in Guatemala. So let's hear from you your reflections on how your community is impacted by pollution.
Una descombración descombran los manglares. El agua de los ríos esteros se pone demasiado caliente y los peces están acostumbrados a estar en agua fría. Cuando uno se mete al agua, abajo es agua fría, pero en este tiempo el impacto está el agua caliente. Uno dice irse a bañar, es mejor ir a un sauna, ¿va? Estar en el agua y como que está hirviendo, entonces peces no hay en estos tiempos, no hay. Por el impacto se van buscando lo más fresco, desaparece En este tiempo el que vive de pesca pasa crisis, porque se van con el propósito de ganar, pero así como van sin nada, regresan sin nada. No hay nada que agarrar, no hay nada que ver. Es un impacto grande para la contaminación de los mares, ¿verdad? Y para la comunidad pesquera.
So as we talked in the previous event, the putting down of the mangroves means that the water near the fisher folk ends up warming up to the point where there is no fish in the ocean where they can go and fish, and this means that the fisher folk who go and fish in this period when it's so warm end up going and spending money to go and fish, and when they get back, they have nothing.
Aparte de que el agua está caliente, ¿verdad? La fumigación que hace las empresas de monocultivos hacen fumigación con químicos y eso corre para el río y cuando miramos flotan peces muertos. Es un impacto también para el medio ambiente que floten las especies, ¿verdad? Que se mueren por la contaminación a través de los químicos. Y aparte los frutales que se arruinan.
So another thing that affects them quite a bit, and this has a lot to do with pollution of the oceans, is that the monoculture companies and producers end up spraying with a lot of fertilizers near the primarily rivers, and these chemicals go into the rivers and then get into the oceans that they normally fish in. and they've seen very often dead fish floating up. And okay, of course, this makes the already dire situation of the very warm waters from the mangroves even worse. And because a lot of the fishers, when they cannot survive out of the water and the fish that they used to live from, they turn into trying to produce agricultural products, and this also has been affected by the monocultures and the fertilizers, as a lot of the primarily fruit plants have been polluted. So this affects their food security even more.
Pues necesitaríamos educar a las personas, ¿verdad?, que no tiren plástico a nuestros mares, nuestros ríos, porque los pececitos muerden la bola y se ahogan con eso, y también se mueren los peces con eso, tortuguitas y variedad de especies, pero se mueren con el plástico.
We need to teach people not to drop plastic and plastic waste into the ocean, as the fishes, the different fish species, and also turtles bite and eat the plastic, and they end up choked in death from the plastic use as well.
Cuando el monocultivo tira químicos, también los mangles, hay árboles que se secan, ¿verdad?, porque tal vez no se adaptan a ese químico y se secan varios manglares. Y cuando encontramos mangles secos, ya solo para leña.
And the putting down of the mangroves is one thing, but it's also the mangroves have also been affected by the chemicals and fertilizers of the monocultures, as when these chemicals arrive into the areas where the mangroves used to are, often they also dry out and also float up dry in the ocean, and they can only use it for as firewood.
Thank you very much, Doris, and thank you, Jose. I forgot to introduce you. So thank you very much for helping us with the translation, the interpretation. So now we are now moving to the next panelist is joining us online. We will hear from Ava Ibanez Amador, who is an associate attorney at Earth Justice, about Earth Oceans program, and how it's using the power of the law to address ocean pollution and protect communities such as the community of Doris, who has just spoken. With that, Ava, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me today and for having me back for those who attended the sessions last week. My name is Ava Ibanez Amador, and I am an attorney at Earth Justice, which is an environmental nonprofit dedicated to protecting wildlife and people, advancing clean energy, and combating climate change. Today, I'm here to briefly explain how marine pollution from the offshore oil and gas industry undermines fundamental rights. I want to discuss its impacts and offer some solutions. So let's start with why offshore oil and gas poses threats to our ocean. Each year, up to 800 million liters of oil enter our ocean, poisoning marine wildlife and jeopardizing the health of coastal populations. Take the Deepwater Horizon disaster as an example. This catastrophic spill released over 3 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, killing marine life and devastating fisheries. As a result, communities in the Gulf faced years of economic hardship, and even today, more than a decade later, individuals suffer from long-term health effects. Globally, since 1995, 711 offshore blowouts and well releases have occurred. And let me be perfectly clear, these are only the reported spills. Many more go unreported or undetected. So beyond spills, as if that was not enough, how does the offshore oil and gas industry harm our ocean? Offshore drilling operations routinely release produced water and drilling fluids into the ocean, which contain heavy metals, carcinogens, and radioactive materials. These discharges bioaccumulate in seafood and pose significant health risks to those who rely on the ocean for food and income. Oil and gas exploration also pollutes the ocean with sound. Seismic blasting, a technique used to locate oil and gas reserves in the ocean floor, generates deafening noise that harms, disorients, and kills marine species, all the way from tiny plankton to the great whales. But despite all these known risks and the possibility of alternatives, governments frequently approve offshore drilling projects without engaging in comprehensive impact evaluation to understand the true extent of risk from the exploration phase all the way to the decommissioning phase. We see this often through our work in Latin America, Africa, the United States, and many other places around the world. Even more concerning, governments often approve these projects without sufficient opportunities for public participation, without consulting the very communities that bear the greatest burden, and without consent from indigenous peoples. Courts in South Africa and Australia, for example, recently ruled in favor of communities whose consultation rights were violated by oil giants. In Mexico, communities that depend on the health of the Gulf of California are actively fighting multiple gas projects, which do not involve offshore drilling, but pose some of the same threats since these projects propose to Gulf of California as a hub to transport gas to Asia. These instances are only a few examples that highlight a systemic problem. So, how can states guarantee human rights in the face of all these impacts? I'll start with the best solution: phasing out offshore oil and gas altogether. Countries like Belize and Costa Rica have set powerful examples by banning offshore drilling. Belize through legislation and Costa Rica through an executive decree, protecting their ecosystems and their communities from irreversible harm. Communities in the Bahamas, for example, have also been vocal about their opposition to offshore drilling, asking their government to protect Bahamian waters and set the tone for what a blue economy should look like, an economy that dutifully protects its marine resources. And again, these are just some examples of the many, many communities that are asking for offshore oil and gas to be halted. So, for nations that do remain reliant on offshore oil and gas, strict safeguards should be enforced. These include, first, mandatory environmental impact assessments that involve independent experts and that assess risks to marine ecosystems, fisheries, and public health. Second, stronger pollution controls to reduce toxic discharges and minimize ecological damage. Third, improve emergency response plans to address spills swiftly and effectively. Fourth, decommissioning requirements that hold operators responsible for cleaning up offshore infrastructure and safely plugging wells. And fifth, meaningful public participation that ensures affected communities, particularly indigenous groups, are consulted in their own language and given real influence in decision-making processes. In conclusion, human rights and ocean health are indivisibly linked. At Earth Justice, we see this every single day with our clients and partners. When offshore oil and gas pollution devastates fisheries, when toxic discharges contaminate food supplies, and when seismic blasting threatens cultural traditions, human rights are at stake. Protecting our ocean is not just an environmental responsibility, it is a moral and legal obligation. By embracing cleaner energy and strengthening requirements governing offshore oil and gas, we can build a future where a healthy ocean sustains life, livelihoods, and fundamental rights for generations to come. With that, I thank you very much for having me again.
Thank you very much, Ava, to share with us what our justice is at the forefront of. Our next speaker, Bruna Campos, is with us here in the room. She's a senior campaigner for offshore oil and gas at Ciel, the Center for International Environmental Law. Bruna, you were also planning to go more in depth in the topic that Ava has a little bit touched on, oil and gas activities through the full life cycle, and also with the focus on oil spills that we have also heard, gas leaks, and the International Tribunal Flow of Sea opinion. So let's hear a few more on this from you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you again for having me again since last week. And since last week, I focused a lot on sort of the connection with deep sea mining. I thought it would also be interesting to focus also on link to marine pollution. And Ava's already done a really good job in explaining the different impacts. So what I will do instead is try to sort of go into more details of specific cases where we've with the links of human rights. So as Ava was saying, the full life cycle of offshore oil and gas is obviously having a major impact on marine pollution, which in a sense is having a major impact on humans. I was going to say, not just people who live on the coast, but let's just say in general, humans are feeling that impact. And the life cycle, the way that Ciel looks at it, but I think most of us can sort of see it in this way, and Ava's already referred to it, is the 4 different phases of offshore oil and gas. So you have the exploration phase, you have the production phase, you have the transport phase, and then you have the decommissioning, or as we like to call it, the abandonment, because they're not being decommissioned, phase. So in the exploration phase, I think Ava's already explained, you have things like sonar and airgun blasts, that this really affects the sort of how cetaceans, sort of marine mammals, react under the sea. So it's like a behavioral change. And I've already mentioned the sort of in South Africa things, but I just wanted to emphasize what actually really happened in this case. It's called the Wild Coast case. And so this was basically it's a court case against Shell. And what happened was during the exploration phase, they already actually noticed a relationship on sort of the fish population. There was less fish on the coast, so they went to court, and with that they actually used different rights. So, for example, cultural and spiritual rights were put forward as sort of like a problem, and the court did say that there was an issue. So this is just to show that sort of it's not just a sustenance issue, which obviously this was also in South Africa, but it's also beyond that. It's the livelihood of coastal communities and people who are dependent on the fish from a spiritual and from a cultural perspective. So it was so that's and also an interesting one. So when we go to production, this kind of so obviously there is the oil spills that usually we connect to, but while it's drilling, there's also a lot of sort of chemicals that are used that also contaminate the water. There's wastewater that comes up, wastewater muds is called. This also comes up, so it's also a problem for marine life. And just as an example of an oil spill, so last year I got the chance of meeting fisher folk from Latin America, from the Union of Latin America. There's a small scale fisher folk. They're called ULAPA, the Association of Latin American Fisher Folk. And there was a really interesting case from Brazil. It was a women cooperative that had been created because there was an oil spill on their coast. And the women and the men as well, but in particular, there was the cooperative that was created was for women. They go into the water sort of halfway to basically take the shellfish. So they're fishing for shellfish. And what's happened is that there is like a massive increase of uterus cancer since the oil spill has happened. And the problem is that it's really hard to sort of like, this is from their experience. they've understood that this is happening, but there wasn't any study done. It's not like there was like a pre and post study. So it's actually really hard to say that it's because of the oil spill, but in truth, it is because of the oil spill. We all know it's because of the oil spill. So this is sort of the kind of situation where you have a health impact because of an oil spill that is being documented by the communities that are living, but it's not actually being taken care of by the governments themselves and sort of saying, okay, like, you know, but also there was a whole issue of how the spill was dealt with. That's a whole other conversation, but it's an ongoing issue with sort of when you have oil that is being produced close to the coast, you have the situation where when there's an oil spill, it just massively affects, and the communities are not actually, there's no reparations for the communities. So this is something also that we want to flag as and is one case of many cases. The other one that we also forget is the transport case. And so transport vessels, so about 40% of all marine cargoes are fossil fuels. So they're transporting fossil fuels around the world. And with the LNG boom, it's even higher. And there is a chronic oil spill that happens. There's also accidents. I think we all think that accidents are rare. Accidents are very common. There's just been an accident off the coast of the UK. I'm not sure if you've been reading, but they were carrying jet fuel. Jet fuel, I guess, in a sense. I don't know how to explain it. But that's sort of in a sense that the issue is not just sort of the ships themselves and the fact that the ships themselves are actually creating pollution, but it's also the cargo that they're carrying that also causes the pollution. So I think that's one other aspect that we also need to remember. And the last, which I've already mentioned, is the infrastructure that gets abandoned. And I think the Niger Delta is very prominent about that. There's a lot of abandonment there. But that's something we think, oh yeah, like, you know, West Africa, we can think of, you know, Nigeria, they've been abandoning. It's not the only place. North Sea is full of abandoned infrastructure. They just don't decommission them. And basically, if you don't decommission a well, it means that well, it continues to leak regularly. So, you know, they take out as much as they want from it. It's too costly to keep taking, so they leave it and they don't decommission it. So they don't close up the hole. They leave it there because they say we might come back to it again, and it just stays there leaking. So there's actually good tracking tools. So if you look at the Global Energy Monitor, there's a tracker. It's and you can see sort of like what's been abandoned or just left behind, in a sense, of the infrastructure that's still there. So what I wanted to also do is spend a little bit more time is talk a little bit of the oil pollution and gas pollution. So because I've already explained the sort of the blowouts. So blowouts, obviously, also we think they're rare, not rare. They also happen on a regular basis, but these are the ones that cause most of the oil pollution that we remember. And one of the things that I just wanted to highlight, because Eva mentioned Deepwater Horizon, is that, and I've mentioned this last week, and I'll mention here again, is that benthic ecosystems have a really hard time in recovering. And we're talking about if we want to restore ecosystems, Deepwater Horizon happened 14 years ago. Still today, there's a lot of loss of coral branches. The corals are not recovering. So it's something that when it happens, it's just really hard to deal with. And then the other is just like the ecosystem will take years to recover, if at all they will recover. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight is that oil pollution is chronic. Again, another tool that you can look at is Cerulean, is from SkyTruth. It tracks oil pollution from oil infrastructure. So it can be from static infrastructure, but also vessels. And it looks at sort of I know they're coming up with a study next month that talks just about the marine pollution and what they've been able to track. But you can also go there yourself and figure it out sort of what's happening. There's a lot of data. There's So I highly recommend, because you can, for example, one of the things that we've noticed is that in the areas that in the North Sea where there's abandoned infrastructure, you also have a very high oil slicks, so a lot of oil pollution. And then the second one that I wanted to talk about is gas pollution, because a lot of people don't sort of think of like, oh, what happens if there's a methane gas leak? So that's actually been very well documented in the Baltic Sea, and that's because of sort of the Nord Stream sort of having leaked. So high concentrations of gas will actually kill off fish. So it's a bit of a problem. And just to give you an example how it links to human rights, so in Senegal, there's an ongoing leak is a gas leak of the we call it GTA. It's just the name of the project that BP is currently drilling. It's Mauritania and Senegal. It borders two countries, and at the moment the leak is ongoing. BP has said that it's a negligible leak, but the leak is still ongoing. So you don't actually know. There hasn't been any evaluation, let alone an independent evaluation. And just to say that 70% of Senegalese food is dependent on, like the protein that they depend on is dependent on fish. So a major fish death in that region will have a major impact on the coastal communities of Senegal. And I think that's really not thought about when you have situations like this, that there's a gas leak. They're still trying to plug the gas leak. They still haven't done it. The last thing I wanted to mention, well, the two last things is that the greenhouse gas emissions that come from offshore oil and gas is a marine pollutant. And this is something that the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, so ITLOS, has given its advisory opinion because this was requested by states and asked what was the correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and the UN Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. And so it's something that we need to remember, is that there is an obligation of states to actually deal with greenhouse gas emissions as a marine pollutant, so reduce and remove that pollution itself. And it's not enough to just actually take measures from UNFCCC. So in a sense, the advisory opinion was clear that those measures are not sufficient, that they need to be measures that are aligned with what is there in the UN Law of the Sea. And so obviously, starting with offshore oil and gas is, given that its activity is happening in the oceans, is a starting place, but obviously fossil fuels in general should be phased out because there is a transboundary impact of whether they're coming from the oceans or not. The last thing I just want to say is what is currently there from a legal perspective in tackling offshore oil and gas. So there are, for example, UN regional sea conventions, but those regional sea conventions actually are currently only dealing with when there's an oil spill. So they don't deal with beforehand. How do we not actually get an oil spill? How do we prohibit certain activities? It's not to say that they can't, it's just they're not doing that. So it's something maybe to think about, especially for governments to think about, as to whether the way that we've been approaching offshore oil and gas and as a marine pollution is not actually dealing with it as a root problem, but it's just dealing with the aftermath of it when a problem happens, when an accident happens. And there's other, obviously, legal, global legal, let's say, agreements. So the International Seabed Authority is another one, which it could actually deal with extraction of marine resources, for which oil and gas is one, but it doesn't deal from a protective point of view. It deals with sort of like which more space can we give to take more from it. So it's something that it actually requires a different mindset in how we look at the ocean. It's not a resource to take, but it's something that we need to actually protect. So those are just the points I wanted to make. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bruna. Those were a lot of interesting points, adding to our list of points discussed during these talks. When you were talking, reminded me also about the Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Human Rights, Marcos Orellana, who has, among many of the reports, also looked at the International Maritime Organization and what they were doing there, but also looking at this from other aspects. Our next speaker here is, and you were referring, the talk where you were speaking last week was on deep sea mining, so I encourage you all to rewatch because it was a very interesting discussion. And ISA, the International Seabed Authority, is meeting these days also, and the current head comes with the pollution in her luggage, so let's see how this will evolve there. Our next speaker, it's one of the co-conveners of these talks, Yves Lador, is the representative of our justice here in Geneva. Most of you know Yves. Yves, I'm sure you have a lot to add to what was already addressed here. So I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Diana. And yes, for this last intervention, I'm a bit afraid that I'm going to add to some of the rather grim description we just had about pollution, but that's unfortunately the case when we talk about pollution. I'm going to cover basically three elements which are coming as addition to what we've just heard. I'm going to talk about chemicals, plastic, which was mentioned, and also the question of infrastructure and dredging, because they are important activities. And as you've said, Diana, some of these elements have been also covered already by the other special rapporteur on toxics and human rights, Marcos Orellana, who was quoted in the special rapporteur's report. So things are totally connected. And I think also, if we're doing this list of challenges, it's also because they are precisely elements and points which will have to be discussed, and we hope seriously discussed, at the United Nations conference, the third conference in 2025 in June in Nice. And when we hear so much about blue economy, definitely blue economy brings opportunities, but it has to take into consideration the negative effect that it's creating, and we've heard some of them, and here I'm going to unfortunately bring a few others. The first thing about chemicals, of course, chemicals, and this is what I'm going to present to you, is coming from an organization which is called Back to Blue, which answers pretty well the question of this discussion, which is, will the ocean remain blue? So we're trying to push all of us in the same direction. The first point is to see that when we're talking about chemical and ocean pollutions, we're talking about a big number of products. We've mentioned here oil. We've heard about fossil fuel, oil, and gas. But as you can see here in the list, you have a number of household products. You have a number of persistent chemicals. So you have a whole list. You have a whole list of products. And what we have to be very aware of is that all what we use finish in the ocean. So the purpose of this list is to see all of the type of elements. Now, it doesn't mean the whole quantity, but elements of that, all of it finishes into the ocean. Even where we have, and this is fortunately the case here in our own region, good sewage systems and depollution mechanisms, there's still a lot going into, for example, the Rhone River here in Geneva. The Rhone River finishes into the ocean. Once it's in the Rhone River, it finishes into the sea, Mediterranean Sea, and then afterwards is connected to the ocean. So all of our activities directly here have a connection and finish in the water. Now, most of the pollution precisely is coming from land-based sources. We've been talking about vessels and, of course, offshore oil. Immediately you'll see, okay, that's pollution because you have extraction in the ocean. And that, of course, if it's mismanaged or just simply the way it's run, will pollute the ocean because it's happening in the ocean. But our activities we have on the land are also contributing to the pollution. And when Bernardo was mentioning plastics, well, that's precisely, you don't produce plastic on the ocean. So all of the plastic which is ending now is coming from the way we are using it in the land. So here you see a number of the activities and what they can be producing. But due for times, I'll go quickly. Here you have a more visual view of where we see dangers, increasing dangers for the health of the planet and the ocean. And we see that you have a shift, which is, and it's a trend which exists since a number of years, more than a decade, where more and more of this pollution is happening in, at least in terms of volume, in Asia. Now we see also that a number of African countries, and some of this is directly linked to dumping, which is different, because here we purposely dump some of our elements. For example, a lot of our clothes here in Europe, they finish on the west coast of Africa. So even when you think you're going to recycle them, they finish on the west coast of Africa. So you have a huge, massive pollution in which a lot is done on the basis of plastics. Plastic actually going back to fossil fuel because that's the origin of it, but it's different than from directly the fossil fuel extraction. So we have to be very aware of that. And here we see what is becoming a really worrying trend is to see an increase of low oxygen zones, which means low oxygen zones mean dead zones. And this reminds me the report that was published a few years ago here at the Human Rights Council. It was a joint report by David Boyd, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and Marco Solana on toxics and human rights. And clearly we have trends now which are really very worrying by an increasing number of sacrifice zones. You have them on the land, of course, and we talk a lot about that. We forget that you also have these type of elements in the ocean. So that's really to understand that you don't only have accidents, you don't only have this misconduct, but the way we are producing generally in our industrial societies impacts directly the ocean day after day on a continuous basis. And this is why now if we go to specifically to plastics, 1 in 3 fish caught today for human consumptions contains plastic. Actually, one of the professors in Japan working on this issue says, why do you eat your garbage through the fish? Just eat your garbage directly, it'll be cheaper. So of course it's a joke, but it's just for us to understand, you know, what the way we are conducting ourselves and what is happening. This is also to say, and it goes to what I was saying before, how you have this kind of a line of activities, which at the end finishes into the ocean. And so we have to understand that it's not always an act of misconduct. For example, the case that was very interestingly presented by Doris, we can see how a misconduct with the shrimp industry will have directly a direct impact on the neighboring communities. But now you also have, as I said before, our regular activities who also do a constant flow of plastics directly into the ocean. And we've been hearing about oil spills. And here I just want to give a specific focus on what exists also as plastic spills. This is an event that happened in May 2021 that was extremely documented. Here you have a report of UNEP. We'll see that you have other reports. So this is the famous oh, I forgot the name. It's written here. It's the press pearl boats that took fire and then sunk just on the coast of Sri Lanka in May 2021. So you see, it's a container vessel which took fire. We'll see the fire became really severe. There's a lot of other pictures also of the fireman interventions in order to stop the fire, but you see it's very damaged. Then it broke. And of course, a lot of the containers went everywhere. And this is what finally you got on the beaches. So you have this is clearly, you know, we talk about oil spills. Here you have a plastic spills. And of course, what happened is you find this directly in the fish. So this is really a very, very severe event in Sri Lanka. This was monitored and was surveyed by the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Marco Solana. He worked on this very much, trying to see how he can help the Sri Lankan authorities. But of course, it means that the whole of the management of the boat and then of the accident was definitely totally inappropriate. And here you have IPEN, the International Pollutant Elimination Network, a very big network working on toxics in general. You did a specific study because you saw the fishes, but they went a bit further, and they studied, and that was published in a scientific review, of the impact of these plastic pellets and also burn chunks directly on the zooplankton. And so, you know, at the very beginning, you think, okay, this is going to have an impact on fishes. We all understand that. With birds, we'll be swallowing it. We understand this is terrible. But over the time, these elements, like the bunt clumps and the plastic pellets, disintegrated, and then they contaminate directly the very, very beginning of the food chain. So these are elements which are extremely problematic. And so this is really to say how what Bernardo has presented about the challenges we have with the plastic treaty. Clearly here we see how much it is absolutely needed. The last point I wanted to present here is the question linked to what has been mentioned just before by Ava and by Bruna. It's a question linked to the infrastructure. At this moment, we have a huge increase of large-scale marine and coastal infrastructure. A lot of that is done also for harbor, for maritime transport. Also, we are improving, and we saw that, for example, with the gas industry, LNG, you needed to build new ports in order to transport all of this gas. And this has a direct impact on the marine in general and on the ocean. This is a study that was done last year by a number of organizations. It's Dutch organization, and there's a reason for that. You'll see why. So the dredging is really the extraction of sand and gravel and so on. I think we understand very well how it works, but it has a number of impacts on the rights of the people surrounding them, and it always first hits the most weakest or disadvantaged communities. Here you see fishers who are protesting for their own area, which is being dredged in South Sulawesi. You have here you see the people who are being displaced because of the dredging, because of course, and the fishermen who are living on the coast, they can't live there anymore, so they have to move somewhere else. So first you have forced displacement. And here they've been living, the only place they were able to find was below a bridge. And here it's an old cemetery. Of course, it's difficult to identify it as an old cemetery. But of course, because of the dredging, the whole coastal area is now retreating, and you see what was built before is disappearing. And here you have a protest in front of a dredging vessel, precisely in order to save the area in South Sulawesi. So, well, the elements I wanted to here underline is that these infrastructure have a direct impact on the coastal communities, because of course it implies displacement and loss of livelihoods for the fishermen. We've heard that already several times, but it also directly has an impact on marine ecosystems, because the sand you're moving is making the water much more gray, and then that you have a decrease in the capacity for the marine environment to take the light and to do the photosynthesis. So it directly has an impact on that. And of course, with the end, a loss of biodiversity. So what is also interesting, and this is why this study was done in the Netherlands, is that you have a lot of dredging going on all around the world, but there's two types of markets. Most of them are closed markets, local markets. They're not big open markets. For the open international markets, actually you only have 4 big companies who are proceeding. 2 of them are Dutch. The 2 of them are Belgium, so there's definitely here some kind of a know-how in the region, which is dominating the whole world. But it means that there is clearly here a target for these different organizations to say we have to reduce the level of dredging that we are doing right now, because we are just basically digging our own grave. So this is really a very, very important challenge, and we hope that this is something that will be also considered when we will be in UNOC 3 in this. These are elements. There's a whole list I think we've heard today about elements that are partly in the report of the special rapporteur and that will need to be tackled very, very seriously. And we see here the human rights impact that it has.
Thank you very much, Yves. I think all your presentations and inputs have demonstrated that we have no more excuses of postponing our ambitious actions on pollution. And this year we have the opportunity to stepping up this human rights and environmental urgency at some of the key moments that you have highlighted. And we have also seen that throughout this event and the other talks that Ocean is a central theme. And human rights impacts just show how much work needs to be done to advance the right to a healthy environment. When we look at all the topics we have discussed, we could have been on and on for hours and hours. I think it was very passionate. So the last word, though we are over time, the last word is for the special rapporteur. I also acknowledge the presence here of the special rapporteur on environmental human rights defenders of the Aarhus Convention. You missed our discussion on the ocean defenders earlier today. Madam Special Rapporteur, the last word is for you.
Thank you very much. I mean, as you can see, it's very complex, the topics, the areas, but I think that a key aspect that I'm very pleased to see is that at the end, of course, the work that we're doing as a special rapporteurs are excuses and also challenges, but also opportunities to link the work that we're doing and open the conversations and the discussions so that we help states to advance and to connect the work that is done, and really hoping that starting at the UN Ocean Conference, but also other efforts have a very strong perspective on the human rights, really advancing the human rights-based approach and having the human rights to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment at the center, including, of course, the human rights of indigenous peoples and local communities and others, and advancing and strengthening the obligation of states. And as we mentioned before, the obligation to control, monitor the activities for businesses. And again, I want to thank you, not only the Geneva Environmental Network, but also Yves, Alex, we're looking for you, and the work that Bruna, Ciel, Francisca's International, also Doris, that you came all viniste de Guatemala, de este viaje tan lejano, y Bernardo and others that are doing so much work, and of course my amazing team from the mandate here in the office for all of these very marathonic sessions, and I look forward to continue coordinating and working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
A big thank you to the Geneva Environmental Network, to Diana and her own team.
I need to
We're the organizers. We're the organizers.
I'll send it to you.
Just switch so you can.
I was only here for 2 sessions, so I was like, anytime.
You meet wherever you want.
Yes, the photo.
Yeah, I know.
Lo que te voy a decir entre lo que te digo y lo que escuchas. ¿Entiendes? Más, pues faltando. Que sí sabes
but it's like, it's one thing, it's 100 pages, right? Yeah, but it looks at like environmental impacts, like from a country perspective, like environmental, general, like biodiversity. Really guys, so I'm going to each section, yeah, the and then there's like a whole section also on like the law, and so this is why I was like trying to think like, to be honest,
Oh, you can be there.
Oh, okay.
It will be a big photo.
Oh, everybody knows.
Bernardo.
You have to join us.
It's charged.